Welcome to our kitchen. Today we prepare a medieval onion soup from a 13th century Tuscan cookbook. We start with the ingredients. We need onions, pork knuckle, cheese, eggs, and the spices: saffron, black pepper, long pepper, nutmeg and cloves. First, we debone the pork knuckle and cut it into small pieces. We don't use the whole pork knuckle. The quantity is up to your taste, but remember that this is an onion soup, and the meat is just meant to add flavor and complexity to the broth. The author doesn't tell us which meat to use. If you want to substitute pork based on other similar recipes, we suggest mutton, beef or chicken. We boil the pork knuckle in salted water. We'll also add a good amount of cheese later, so don't use too much salt now. We cook the pork knuckle for about 15 minutes. Then we'll continue cooking it with the onions for another 20 minutes. The cooking time changes depending on the meat you choose. If you use a meat that cooks quickly, for example chicken, you can start cooking it with the onions without pre-cooking it. Whereas onions are frequently present in other plates, there are few recipes in the Italian medieval cookbooks in which they are the main ingredient. For example, to prepare salads and pies. Meanwhile, we prepare the other ingredients. We cut the onions lengthwise. This way they will not dissolve during the cooking. The 13th century physician Michele Savonarola describes two main varieties of onions, white and red. He considers the white and round onions easier to digest, but onions are usually considered by the physicians heavy for the stomach and dead. If eaten raw, Paulus of Aegina writes in the 7th century, they are scarcely nutritious. The agronomist Pietro de Crescenzi in the 13th century adds that onions nourish well if cooked 2 times, the second one with very fat meat and aromas. Now we prepare the cheese, cutting it into small pieces. We chose a firm mixed milk cheese made with cow and sheep milk. The author doesn't tell us which cheese to use. We infer that it's not a hard-aged cheese, because when he uses that type of cheese in other recipes, he grates or cuts it into pieces. Then he adds it at the end instead of cooking the cheese with the other ingredients, the method specified in this recipe. Now we grind in the mortar the black pepper. This recipe is part of an anonymous 14th century manuscript, conventionally called Anonimo Toscano. It's mainly a translation into vernacular of the Liber de Coquina, a 13th century Latin cookbook. But there are several interesting additions and variations, such as this recipe. Then we soak the saffron in warm water. Saffron is one of the most used spices in medieval cookbooks. It was widely cultivated in Italy, but it was also imported to meet the high demand. We cook the onions with the pork knuckle, adding the cheese, black pepper and saffron. The author refers to black pepper and saffron as optional, but sprinkling the other spices on the finished dish is essential for the recipe. Saffron and pepper are the spices that the anonymous author of this recipe uses the most in his other soups. So we suggest to use them, but add just a little quantity of pepper to prevent the plate from becoming too spicy, because we'll add more pepper with the other spices on the finished dish. We cooked the onions for 20 minutes. The cooking time can change depending on the variety of onions and the thickness of the slices. Onions were widely used in medieval cuisine, but some physicians considered them harmful if not properly cooked. Michele Savonarola in the 13th century warns us against onions. He says that they cause a deep sleep, and if eaten frequently, they can lead to apoplexy. He writes also that onions confuse the intellect, and therefore they are not suitable for scholars. A lord, he continues, should forbid his falconers to use onions, because they cloud the sight. In conclusion, he considers onions a food for robust and strong men. It's interesting to note that medieval cooks often follow, at least partially, the physician's prescriptions, as we can see examining many other recipes. But frequently, the physicians themselves disagree. In any case, the taste of the Lord and the culinary habits tend to prevail upon the medical advice. Meanwhile, we grinded the nutmeg, long pepper and cloves. The author doesn't list the spices to use. We chose among the most common in the medieval cookbooks: nutmeg, cloves and long pepper. You can also add ginger and cinnamon, used by the author in similar recipes. An extensive use of spices is one of the most remarkable features of medieval cuisine. They were used since the antiquity, but except for pepper, the author seems to prefer Mediterranean aromatic herbs and spices. These continued to be used throughout the Middle Ages, but always accompanied by the constant presence of the Eastern spices. Then we beat 1 egg. When the onions and the pork knuckle are cooked through, we add the egg and stir until it's cooked. It will take about 30 seconds or less. We often find in these and other cookbooks a beaten egg used to finish the soups. We serve the onion soup hot, sprinkling the spices. This hearty onion soup is a perfect example of how a common and humble food could become the main ingredient in a dish suitable for a medieval noble. If you're interested in ancient foods and flavors, or you're just looking for unusual and delicious recipes, please subscribe our channel.